As an organizational psychologist and professor of management, I've been studying women's careers and lives for nearly 15 years. And I've learned a lot through my research, but I've learned just as much in my own life. And today I want to share with you how my perspective on this topic has shifted as a result of both my research and my life. My mom was profoundly inspired by the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. And while she was told she could either be a teacher or a nurse, she wanted me to know that I could be anything I wanted to be when I grew up if I worked hard enough. And like so many girls growing up in the 70s and 80s, we were free to be you and me. And I paid attention to her message. In elementary school, I wrote this poem about my mom. And you can see these things are already on my mind. By middle school, I started leaning in. I internalized her message. I was leaning in middle school. I was crying over A-minuses in high school and pulling all-nighters. And to this day, one of the most stressed out I've ever been was the day I found out whether I was accepted to the University of Pennsylvania early decision or not. Well, I was. And when I got there, I was surrounded by brilliant young women who had internalized the exact same message as me. We could be doctors, lawyers, engineers if we worked hard enough. Take my roommate, for example. She was pursuing her degree in international business from the Wharton School and, just fulfilling her rigorous pre-med requirements in her spare time. But I started to notice something. A lot of us were confused about this whole having it all thing. We believed it was possible if we just made all the right choices, but we still weren't exactly sure what those right choices were. Well, I nominated myself to figure it out. I was going to research this dilemma, report back to my friends, and have the perfect work-life balance. Perfect. So in 2002, I headed to Michigan State University to pursue a PhD in organizational psychology, where I would start studying women's careers and lives. And I began by studying doctors. Being a doctor was a career that high-achieving women like my roommate pursued, so that's where I began. And at the time I started studying this topic in 2003, women made up half of medical students, a drastic increase since we were little girls. So I surveyed hundreds of medical students. And not surprisingly, the women med students reported wanting this elusive work-life balance. And even as first and second year medical students, they knew exactly which medical specialties were most accommodating of life outside work. Yet, when it came time to choose the specialties for themselves, they largely picked specialties that they knew weren't going to be conducive to the work-life balance that they so desperately desired. So why the disconnect? I was baffled. Why weren't they just making the right choices? Well, as I mentioned, I'm a hard worker, so I just kept right on researching. And in 2007, I accepted a tenure-track position as a professor of management where I continued to study women's careers and lives. And then, just a week before I was set to begin my new job, I learned that my mom had been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And here I was trying to figure out how to lean into my brand new career while at the same time being there for my family and for my mom. And this idea that I had that if I just worked hard and made all the right choices didn't quite seem like it was going to cut it. So before I had even begun my new job, I found myself in my boss's office asking him to adjust my teaching schedule to accommodate travel home to be with my family for longer weekends. And I'm really grateful that I work at a place with the kind of culture that made that accommodation for me without a second thought. But my perspective started to shift. And I started to realize that hard work and making all the right choices wasn't the complete picture. Admittedly, I was pretty lucky to make it till my late 20s before I made this realization. That's a real place of privilege that I got to come from. But I started to shift my focus to studying more how the workplace impacts women's careers and lives. And 2007 turned out to be a pivotal year for the study of gender equity. The National Academies Press published a report stating that the reason there aren't more women in science, and in leadership positions in science isn't simply because girls aren't choosing those careers or leaning in once they get there. Instead, they pointed to the unrecognized features of the organizational culture that affect men and women differently. And what did they mean by organizational culture? Simply put, they were referring to the hidden assumptions about how we do things around here. And in medicine, that might translate to the hidden assumption that doctors should work whichever shift they're assigned without complaining or asking for adjustments, regardless of how inconvenient or unpredictable that might be, especially for someone with kids. And this shift started to match what I was learning in my own life. So in 2009, when I was invited to join a research team at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, studying women's careers in academic medicine, I jumped at the opportunity. And we set out to find those hidden and subtle assumptions of the organizational culture that impact men and women differently. And what we found was conclusive. Culture matters. In the best cultures, women were more satisfied, more committed, and experienced less work-family conflict. But culture mattered even more than we ever anticipated. In the worst cultures, women reported high levels of conflict almost universally across the board, whether they were working 40, 50, or 60+ hours a week. Not only that, women working 40 hours a week in the worst cultures actually reported more stress and more conflict than their counterparts working 60+ hours a week in the best cultures. A bad culture couldn't make up for 20 hours extra of work per week. So here was the critical question. What differentiated the best cultures from the worst ones? Well, we found that there were 4 key differences. First, in the best cultures, women had equal access to resources and opportunities. Things like salary, lab equipment, administrative support, mentoring. In the worst cultures, women had less of everything. And that included really subtle things like an invitation to go out for drinks after work. And we all know that those subtle things can add up over time. Second, in the best cultures, there was an acknowledgement that there are unconscious biases against women in leadership and science positions. And people were willing to talk about this openly. In the worst cultures, women who raised concerns about bias were seen as whiners, and they were isolated and often ignored. Third, in the best cultures, there was an appreciation that people have lives outside work. And this was taken into consideration in key decision-making, things like parental leave, scheduling of shifts, nursing breaks, promotion tracks. In the worst cultures, women with kids were seen as less committed to their careers and often placed on the mommy track. Finally, in the best cultures, leaders openly and actively cared about gender equity, and they were willing to critically examine their own departments and ask the tough questions about equity, bias, and life outside work. They were willing to advocate on behalf of women faculty and put their money where their mouth is. In the worst cultures, leaders turned a blind eye to gender issues, or even worse, denied their existence. And as we were making these remarkable discoveries in our research, my own perspective continued to shift as I got married and became a mom. In fact, my mom was present for the birth of my son Warren in 2009, nearly 3 full years after her initial diagnosis, far exceeding the 6-month life expectancy that doctors had given us. Unfortunately, she passed away shortly thereafter, the same week I was supposed to return from my maternity leave. So what must be done to honor my mother's legacy and all our mothers' legacies to create a world where women can thrive in any career that they choose? Well, a popular suggestion is to get more girls interested in science careers and then help them, give them mentoring when they get there. And while this is great, it still reinforces the same message that I heard, that if women work hard and make the right choices, that they can have it all. but both my research and my life have made it perfectly clear. These are insufficient solutions. Real change requires institutional transformation, and that begins with transparency. The power of culture comes from the fact that, in large part, it's so often subtle or unspoken. That makes it really easy to ignore. By illuminating the cultures of our workplace, we can begin to move towards cultures of gender equity. And my daughter Eve wants to be a doctor when she grows up. And though she never had the opportunity to meet my mom, I tell her the same thing that my mom always told me, that she can be anything she wants to be when she grows up. And both my research and my life inspire me to create workplaces where that's more true than ever. So starting today, I'm asking each of you to stop looking at little girls as the cause of and solution to our grown-up gender problems. Instead, I'm asking you to confront the hidden assumptions in your own workplace that disadvantage women and hurt us all. And by doing so, I believe that we can fulfill the dream that my mother had for me that she wrote on the first page of my baby book, and the same dream that I have for my daughter, to be happy. Thank you.